In this lesson, we're going to learn about masking. Okay, so what we need to do is grab a new layer that we're going to place on our timeline. So let's come over here to our photos folder, and just really quickly to make a distinction, it doesn't actually become a layer until you've placed it on the timeline. While it's over here, it still would be considered a file or an asset. Just to keep that in mind, the asset that we're going to be grabbing and turning into a layer is going to be this sinkhole. So grab that sinkhole JPEG, and we'll left click and drag it beneath our robot, above our robot track. Now the reason I want it beneath my robot is because I want it behind my robot, which is my foreground, but on top of my background, the street background. Okay, now you'll notice it's a little bit difficult to be able to see this, see the edges, because it's pretty large. So let's scale it down a little bit. I'm going to come down here and we'll take a look at our scale property for our sinkhole, and we'll just start kind of dragging this down right in here around that size. Okay, so we're at around 38%. Now, you don't have to scale something perfectly uniformly. So right now it's 38% tall by 38% wide, but we can also scale it ununiformly by maybe grabbing the top edge and bringing that down like that. So now you can see that this one is 38 and this one is 35. So if you do this up here in your composition where you're scaling it differently, you see what's happening is I'm kind of causing this to now be more parallel with the way that this street is set up, because you'll notice that here I have this line along that back that I can tell is a line along the ground, and if I want to line that up with the lines I have on my street here, you see that's about the right size. Or I could maybe even make it a little bit closer by doing that, and now I'm actually aligning this edge, and that looks actually a little bit better, a little bit more parallel, like it could actually belong in this scene if you can use your imagination for a moment and block out that edge. Looks like that hole could really be on the same ground plane as the plane that our robot is on. So we can change the scale in a way that's not uniform. So that's kind of the point of that. We can do it here in the composition panel by grabbing one corner and not holding shift. If you want to change it uniformly, you can hold shift while you click and drag and it will be uniform. Grab one corner and you can move it by itself and it will not be uniform. Now, if you want to change the scale down here, it's always going to link these. So now that it's not being scaled uniformly, you see that there's always going to be that offset there where they still are going to scale up and down together because they're linked. So there's a little bit of difference between doing it uniformly here and here. So the way that I can have total control over one axis over the other is to click this little constrain proportions, which is going to break that link and allow me to scale it differently here. Okay, so once you're happy with the position of this and the scale, which I was playing around with some values earlier and I found that about 17.3 for that Y scale, and then about 32.3 for that X scale was perfect. It really made that feel great right there, like it's really lying on the ground. And then for the position, this is actually, it's pretty close, but I want to move it over into the middle of the street a little bit more. So the way that we can do that is just kind of by changing some of these values. So let's get it into position, keeping in mind that this is going to be where the helicopter crashes, and so we need to have it far enough back that we do feel like the helicopter isn't the same size as our robot. So even though it may look like it looks a little bit too high, you might want to put it here so that that edge is, staying on the concrete. Know that we're going to be masking this in a moment, and it's all going to work out. Okay, so I'm going to put it right about there. And for a second, let's turn off our robot's visibility. Okay, so now we're getting to the good part. We're going to start creating our mask. So if I zoom in here, you can see the areas of our original picture that need to go so that we can integrate this into our new road here and look like we've put a hole in the road. So to mask, you're going to come up here and grab the pen tool. And you can also mask with the rectangle or the rounded rectangle or the ellipse tool. I'm just left clicking and holding to look at all these options. But in my case, I need to create a pretty customized mask because of the jaggedness of this hole. So I'm going to use the pen tool, and that's going to allow me to create a very customized type of look. So I can middle click to toggle away from that pen tool to kind of move this around. Let's start over here on the far left side. So I'm just going to click, and you'll see what happens whenever I click is a mask drop down is created. And we've got all these different properties for that mask. And also a dot is created, which is a point in that mask. So now I can continue to click around the edge of that hole and add more points to the mask. And I'm just left clicking. I'm not left clicking and dragging really yet. I'll middle click though to move over a bit here. And it looks like I got that one a little bit too high. I'm going to undo that, and we'll just kind of continue through this. Don't really care about having that crack in there, so I'll just keep that out of view. Now I really like some of the cracks we have here in the road, so I'm going to start making this mask a little bit wider around the front side, just so that we have a little bit more room to work with in our picture. Okay, and in this area it gets cut off just a little bit, but because we're masking, we can just close the path by clicking on that first point. You'll see the little circle that is created. I'm still left clicking and holding, and you might notice that now I've got this Bezier handle, which allows me by left clicking and holding to kind of change the interpolation of that path of those lines. So I might want to pull this out to kind of have that rounded off on that edge there. Okay, so now we've gotten rid of a lot of the outside area that we don't want to show up on our sinkhole. So that's great, but we still have some concrete here that doesn't look very good. So what we can do is come into our mask feather option, and you'll get to that again by toggling down your masks, taking a look at the mask that we just drew, and going in here to your mask feather option, and we'll just kind of pull that property up, and you'll notice that as we do that, this mask begins to expand. We start to get kind of a more feathered edge here. Now the more that I do it, the more that it appears integrated, but I also am getting the problem of seeing the hard edge where the image ends. So what I can do is use another property called the mask expansion, and I can expand it to go in this direction to the outside of the picture. So if I drag it right, I'm expanding it outwards, but I can also expand it inwards. So it starts at 0, but I can go negative. So you see that value is negative now, and we're expanding to the inside of our mask. So now the feather's kind of going in the other direction. So if I expand this inward, you might start to notice that it gets a little too hazy on the back end. So we can turn down our feather a little bit, and you see how the edge will get a little bit harder. And then you can come into your mask expansion and just continue kind of playing around with that value and of the value of your feather until you get that to a good spot for you. Now this really does appear to be pretty continuous, besides the fact that the color is a little bit off. But we do have a really nice composite happening with just having kind of that hole that feathers onto our street. Now let's say maybe I don't like this edge back here. I'm going to come up here and grab my selection tool, and I can just grab some of these points and start to pull back on them so that I get a little bit of a harder edge along the back of my hole here. And I don't want to come out too far because I do still want to be able to have a little bit of semi-transparency kind of on that back end there on the edge, and I want to be able to see my original street, my background plate, and not see too much of this, but really that actually looks pretty good. So later in the course we'll be doing some color correction to get that to fit even better. So that we don't have kind of this lighter halo around the edge. But for now, that looks pretty good, and all we did was scale it down and give it a mask. Now you can play around with the values even more. If you feel like it still looks like it's a little bit too high, you could come in and scale it down. Now you're going to start having some problems grabbing those handles if you're zoomed out very far and it's very close to one of the points on your mask. So you may want to just control the scale from the project, or from the transform parameters here. So maybe if you want to make it a little bit flatter, you can do that. I wouldn't go too flat because it's going to make the whole look like it's just a little bit too narrow. So we can play around a little bit with the perspective, because honestly a lot of this hole is going to become covered by our helicopter and all the fire and rubble that we'll be adding. So the hole is really just kind of a starting point for us in our composite, and we can turn back on our robot and you can see already it looks pretty good. So in our next lesson I'm going to show you another method of kind of doing what we just did that's a little bit more formal than masking. Masking is very free-form and customized, but if something is coming out of a 3D software, or maybe you're doing some kind of motion graphics, you can use something called an alpha pass or an alpha channel, and it's going to automatically cut the background out for you. And that's actually how we get the transparency for our robot. So you'll notice our original robot didn't have a background. He was already transparent. That's because he already contained an alpha channel. But sometimes your alpha channel or your alpha pass is going to be separate, and you won't have the luxury of just having that transparency already there for you. So I'm going to show you how, as a compositor, you can use a separate alpha pass with your just RGB color information or your beauty pass, whatever it is that you have, to cut out the background, and so you don't have to go in and mask it by hand like we did with the sinkhole. Now obviously the sinkhole is a real photograph, so we have to mask it. You can't get an alpha pass for something that's in the real world like that. But what we're going to be using the alpha pass for is our helicopter. So join me in the next lesson where we separate our helicopter from its original rendered background using an alpha pass.